This is the IBJ podcast for the week of February the 10th, 2020, brought to you by the law firm Craig DeVault. I'm Mason King. We're all accustomed to driving down Indiana highways and seeing the corn and the soybeans. But last year, a former staple of Indiana farms made its long-awaited comeback. A little bit of background. In December 2018, President Trump signed legislation removing hemp from the Controlled Substances Act, effectively ending a nearly 50-year prohibition. 6 months later, Indiana lawmakers cleared the way for Hoosier farmers to begin growing hemp legally. And they're pretty excited because hemp has a lot of industrial applications, and it also can be used to create cannabidiol, or CBD oil, which many believe has a wide range of health benefits. According to market researchers, the CBD market topped $4 billion in 2019. It could reach $24 billion in 2025. Now, of course, this is a very new industry for the state. And one of the interesting initial developments is that Hamilton County, right here in the Indianapolis metropolitan area, is becoming one of the state's centers for refining CBD oil. IBJ's North of 96 reporter, Kurt Christian, has been following the millions of dollars in CBD-related investment in the county, and he joins us to talk about how those operations are closing the gap that has developed in the state's CBD supply chain. Kurt, thanks for making time for us today.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me.
Under state law, farmers still need to obtain a license, right, to grow hemp?
Yeah, there's a process and an application period, and they're still nailing down a lot of what's going to come with the fees associated with that license. But yeah, it's if you don't have a license, you're engaging in illegal activity.
So how many farmers have, or how many operations have applied for a permit or received a permit?
So they, in 2019, had 180 licenses that they gave out. That's about 100 outdoor grow operations and about 30 indoor sort of greenhouse grow houses. And that leaves 50 for processors, which is largely what my story looks at.
So when did the farmers start growing? About midway through last year?
Yeah, so some started as early as May, but most planted in June. I'm told the plant can mature in as little as about 90 days, but when you look at the survey that the Office of the Indiana State Chemist did, most of those farmers started to cut those plants down in August or November.
How many acres can we say in 2019 were devoted just to this?
That's actually quite interesting because outdoor growers had planned 5,300 acres. They planted 4,300 acres, so about 1,000 acres less. And then they actually harvested another 1,000 fewer acres. That's 3,300 acres that were harvested in 2019. Now, there was some increase for indoor grow operations from a planned 323,000 square feet to 373,000 square feet. And while that's a 115% harvested over what was planned, you got to remember that's really in total only about 8.5 acres. So when you look at everything in acres, we're seeing far fewer acres harvested than were planned.
Now, why would a farmer want to grow hemp?
I think a lot of these farmers were initially sold on this idea that there was going to be crazy revenues coming in, that they were all going to see a profit, and really in the industry they refer to it as sort of a green rush right now. I do think rush might be fair in some cases. While a lot of these farmers wound up sort of stockpiling their hemp crop for better returns, those who weren't able to make the decision themselves often lost money, and that's because they weren't able to find that sort of middleman between maybe Nestle wants a CBD infused coffee and they've grown a hemp, but you aren't just dropping dried plant material into coffee grounds and selling it. You've got to have that hemp refined. You got to take out that valuable CBD, and then it gets put into that coffee or whatever end product you may have.
So they had the product. I mean, they were growing and drying the hemp plant, but they couldn't get somebody to process it for them. Or there were fewer processors than the market needed.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, there were about 50 processor licenses approved in 2019, but Don Robeson, the state's seed administrator who oversees that licensing process, said only about 2 or 3 came online. And so we had farmers who, excited by the prospects, connected with maybe a seed supplier or got clones from someone and started planting, but they didn't have an extractor lined up, a refinery lined up, then you're just left with that raw hemp material.
Yeah.
While you may have options there, it's a very complex and really scary process to think about trying to go out of state to get that extracted or processed. And so I think that's why a lot of those farmers were left with full barns at the end of the season.
The process makes it a little more difficult to take that hemp outside the state?
Yeah, there's certain approvals. In talking with John Bales of Biodynamic Ventures, who's doing some of this work in the state, he described having to let every single police post from start of trip to end of trip know that he's pulling hemp through their state.
Oh, no.
And so you can imagine, I'm sure there are 10 times as many steps as I've outlined here, and doing that legally and responsibly that just your farmer who's trying this out for the first year wouldn't know how to do and maybe just doesn't want to do.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of daunting tasks, very simply, what does the refiner do? How do you get CBD oil from the dried plant?
You can get these processors and these extractors who are varying sizes. Some will offer wraparound services. So again, John Bales with Biodynamic Ventures explained how he'll set farmers up with the buyers, those Nestle's, those Monster Energy drinks, those tincture companies that need the CBD from hemp. He'll make sure that they line up so that farmers are creating the right amount of hemp for that end product, supply and demand. As for the scientific part of it, essentially what's happening is dried hemp will be dropped off with one of these facilities. If they've got a laboratory in-house, they can test it for heavy metals or toxins or pesticides. They're determining the appropriate levels for all of that. The FDA is forming its own rules. Very complicated stuff. So you may use an independent lab to take care of that. But from that point, you essentially heat it in a specialized oven, put it through an extractor, which it either uses ethanol as a solvent or CO2. Most of those that I profiled in my piece use CO2. When they put that hemp through the extractor, it basically breaks down those structures in hemp, these sort of resin glands that hold the THC and the CBD. It breaks it down and separates those compounds. And it sounds really heady and it sounds really scientific. And if you go to one of these facilities, you do see that mad scientist giant Erlenmeyer flasks and shiny stainless steel machines. And they produce this really vibrant colored product that's called CBD distillate. From there, maybe create lotions or tinctures.
It's like crude oil, basically.
Yeah. And I really like that image when they refer to these facilities as refineries, because it does wind up that CBD oil is crude oil that you can then turn into any number of products.
So of the refineries that are in operation, it sounds like a majority of them are in Hamilton County. Is that just coincidence, or is there something driving that?
Don Robeson, again, the seed administrator for the state, had speculated and said, well, the reason why we're seeing all these millions of dollars pumping into these facilities is because this is expensive equipment. This is specialized equipment. It requires a specialized workforce. And so it may be that in addition to Indiana having some great soil, we're one of those states who are sort of in the tobacco belt. Wherever tobacco grew well, so too does hemp. But in addition to all those things, it might have been that there was already some native money here, some individuals or small companies who could have been privately financed here at the beginning with these first couple of $1 million to get this up and running. They're only able to do that because they've got that money in hand. A lot of traditional banks just aren't ready to jump into this risky market yet and really aren't interested in an industry that's so new, that's still changing, that's still technically under emergency rules. That's something that banks look at and really often turn away for being so risky.
So yeah, Hamilton County, which we know, of course, is one of the most affluent, if not the affluent counties in Indiana, you would have individuals who would have that kind of money and would not have to risk going to a bank and trying to explain exactly what they're up to.
I've heard from those processors that we're rounding the bend on traditional loans. Banks are starting to catch up. up. Some of them are able to identify sort of homegrown banks that are willing to take that risk and maybe put their name out there as a bank that supports hemp farming and this sort of agro-business venture. And so it's more and more becoming accessible, and I think that's where you'll see it grow in those places outside of Hamilton County where there's so much seed money to really start up a project like this. But what I'm also hearing from those processors is, again, this is highly specialized equipment, so you need advanced manufacturing experience, it's agro-business, it's chemistry. Of course, you're going to need a specialized workforce. With Dow Agro, with Eli Lilly, with the Splenda manufacturing facility nearby, you've already got that workforce in place for an industry that didn't even exist in Indiana.
Yeah, right. And speaking of, agri-science and agribusiness, Purdue, is about 20 minutes away.
This is an industry that's been born out of university researchers. It wasn't as if 2018 was the very first time that anybody planted hemp in Indiana. There have been research operations that have been ongoing, a couple dozen places where academia was sort of studying the plant and figuring it out as a commercial product. And so I think, of course, Purdue is one of the top institutions here in the state that could handle something like that.
Yet another instance where, workforce really kind of dictates why and where something happens, especially in Indiana. All right, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
The IBJ Podcast is brought to you by Krieg DeVault, a trusted and dynamic law firm representing a wide variety of local, regional, and national clients. Committed to each other and to every client, Krieg DeVault prides itself on integrity, professionalism, respect, and excellence. Financial institutions, global manufacturers, national healthcare providers, and successful organizations of all sizes and market focus rely on Krieg DeVault to create innovative and successful business solutions. Connect today at www.kriegdevault.com.
All right. We're back with the IBJ Podcast. I'm Mason King, and I'm with Kurt Christian, IBJ's North of 96 reporter, and we're talking about the fledgling CBD oil industry taking root in Hamilton County. Now, you mentioned John Bales. He is the CEO, I believe, of Biodynamic Ventures, which, among other things, is a grower. I know they have several facilities in central Indiana, and they've developed, I think, what do they call them, mother plants? Is that right?
Yeah. So in the hemp industry, the female plant gets all the attention. One of the things that farmers really have to worry about is their crop going hot, which is to say that it gets too much of the psychoactive compound THC, which is, largely what distinguishes hemp from marijuana.
That's right. Yeah, I forgot to bring that up. That's the difference between hemp and marijuana is the THC. Hemp, very little THC, will not get you high. Marijuana, a lot more THC.
Yeah, and there's a allowable, permissible range of THC content within certain CBD products. But for farmers, largely, they've got to keep crops below 0.3% THC. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, that crop is destroyed.
And that's something that I assume then the Biodynamic Ventures would offer, which is, the plant that we're giving you and that you can start growing your crop with, guaranteed not to need to be destroyed in the middle of the process.
Yeah, I don't know if they put a guarantee or a seal of certainty on it. There's so much that's still uncertain, whether it's weather or genetics or what have you, but yeah, that's what Biodynamic Ventures is largely based around, is providing a what's called a clone of a mother plant that's been shown to do well in this environment and not explode with THC, and that's really how they set up farmers to succeed.
And then it has since moved into the refining business as well. It has some partnerships with, I think, Westfield-based, and I'm going to screw this up, Thieneman Construction.
Yeah, I think that's a good attempt at it. I don't know if I can do better.
And then a company called Zeleos, which I believe is out of Colorado.
Yeah.
They have formed a group called BDX Indiana. Just in last October, they announced plans to invest $24 million in a 10,000 square foot extraction facility. They've already put some of that money to use. And I think that they actually are already beginning to look at sort of vastly increasing the amount of CBD oil that they could refine.
I think one of the interesting things is here in this first phase, they're sort of filling the space And really what's a multi-tenant building, in addition to Thienemann construction there, I think that there's maybe a daycare on the other end of the facility. So it's a really interesting place to land, but soon they'll be building onto that building with, I think, a 56-foot tall structure to house what John Bales says is one of the largest extractors maybe in the nation. And so that's going to really ramp up their output and I think really just multiply how many kilograms of CBD distillate and other CBD products they put out in a given month.
So that's an example maybe of one of the biggest, if not the biggest, refiners. But there are some more significantly smaller, but obviously at this point still valuable. I was going to call them mom and pop operations, but they're actually a little bit different from a familial sense. What are we talking about?
The funny thing is, in those three companies that I talked to for our print story, each one of them had a father-son component. John Bales with Biodynamic Ventures, certainly they're sort of the big dog here where they've had operations in other states. They also, in addition to hemp, work in legal states with cannabis. But John Bales helped his son to cultivate an acre of hemp. Toby and Wes Holcomb, his father's son, also in Westfield, really just a mile away from where BDX Indiana is doing its operations.
Yeah, that's NXT Labs.
Yeah.
I think, right? And they have about a $2 million facility, 6,000 square feet.
They're doing things slightly differently. I don't think any of these processors are going to be a 1-to-1 ratio, whether it's scale or wraparound services, but they're doing some of those same things, again, less than a mile away. So you can really see that this is becoming sort of a hotbed for processors. In Carmel, we wanted to demonstrate that it isn't just in these rural or quasi-rural areas that you're getting this. There are grow houses in Carmel. Agrizen Life Sciences is a Carmel-based company that's looking to get into this sort of extraction and processing. They'd already done research and development and had cultivation research facilities in Carmel. Now they're looking to expand and get into lab work and doing some of this sort of refinery service that these other companies are also providing.
And that's a father-son organization as well.
Yeah, that's a Brian and Austin Schrader. It's really interesting. I think it's iconic within agribusiness to have sort of these familial relations where a lot of people will assign that image to a family farm, and this is really kind of the next step in that supply chain, and you're still seeing that sort of family business component carry through, which is interesting, to say the least.
I just assumed that there would be some sort of national CBD oil refining interest, some sort of giant conglomerate that would sweep in and plant its operations somewhere and just sort of take over the market. Has that been the case in other places?
So I think in Canada, there's already been that established class of companies that will do this sort of thing. I think Canopy Growth might be one of those.
Well, yeah, as we say, it's a really new market. Right now, I think you said we're less than 5,000 acres of production. So it's possible that they could be waiting to see what the real capacity is, basically.
And I mentioned CBD-infused coffee or a Monster Energy drink that has CBD in it, but John Bales of Biodynamic Ventures warned against that sort of thinking. He thought that was sort of pie in the sky for the fact that these are major companies that depend on consistency. And we're so early in the process right now that we don't have enough proof to show that we can be consistent. And so I don't think that we're going to see, Coca-Cola or whomever pay for an extraction facility here until we've got a little, maybe a second, third harvest under our belts. Who knows?
Now, if this just doesn't work out, I assume that the farmers can plant something else. But for the processors, is there a plan B? Is there something that they can shift to if, this just doesn't add up for them?
We saw in the state's survey that despite those farmers not realizing profits, a majority of them were committing to growing here in 2020. And I think that confidence translates to that next step in the supply chain where a lot of those extractors are very confident. They see those market projections in the billions of dollars and they believe in it, and they see banks coming around. And so the pieces are coming together. And I think most are confident that they're going to make it through this green rush as a premier or a boutique processing facility. There are options for a plan B. I believe at NXT specifically, Toby and Wes Holcomb talked about being botanical extractors. It's not necessarily limited to hemp. It could be pine or lavender, which is used in essential oils or any number of things. And so I think that there is a potential plan B here, and that while it might be a risky investment at this point, there's a way to pivot and make sure that those investments don't run afoul.
So is the sense here, as we probably head into the 2020 growth season in a few months, that the farmers are going to have more places to put their product?
That's the hope. I don't think we're going to see uninhibited growth, in part because state and federal government is still sort of lining up what they want to do here. In 2020, the state's going to limit the number of licenses to 300, which at 180 in 2019, it's not crazy to think that we wouldn't even reach 300, but they put a cap there to say, hey, this is as much as our office can handle at this point. We're still figuring things out. For those things we're hearing from farmers about needing to balance a market, we're just going to go ahead and cap the number of licenses and keep it relegated, keep it controlled, and sort of keep it on track.
But there would be more capacity for production or for processing.
Yeah, that's the thought. And I think as these processors who get established start to show what their yields look like and prove to others who are interested and maybe more risk averse and less of an early adopter, once they start to see proof of concept here that you can turn a profit, you can cultivate a farmer's network, they might be more willing to jump in. And certainly with those 50 processor licenses already approved in 2019 and only 2 or 3 having come online, there are people lined up.
Yeah, they're there. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's check back in next year and see what happens.
Cool.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kurt.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
My thanks again to Kurt. If you want to learn more, he has a story in the latest issue of IBJ about Hamilton County's role in Indiana's hemp supply chain. And before you get on with the rest of your week, there are a few other stories I want to draw to your attention. The can't-miss package this week is IBJ's 28th annual edition of 40 Under 40, featuring the young leaders making names for themselves in central Indiana. From Stacy Atkinson, chancellor of the Richmond campus of Ivy Tech Community College, to Mohammed Yassin, executive vice president of marketing for software firm Perk. The class of 2020 is especially strong, as is our online multimedia platform for this year's class. You can access that from the IBJ.com homepage. Also in this week's paper, Sam Quinn discusses how the experience of running for Indianapolis mayor has informed the legislative priorities of State Senator Jim Merritt. He's filed bills in the current legislative session concerning food deserts and landlord-tenant relationships, and in next year's budget writing session, he plans to tackle roads and crime. And John Russell explores the future of Medicaid in Indiana now that the Trump administration has announced plans to allow states to add eligibility requirements, benefit changes, and drug coverage limits. Again, you can find these stories in the latest issue of IBJ, which you, of course, have delivered to your home or office, and online at IBJ.com. And remember, to get full and unfettered access to all of IBJ's award-winning business content, just click the subscribe button. Thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast, which is edited by Leslie Weidenbender. I'm Mason King, and we'll be back again next week.